Edina negates. Contention 1 is proxy war. U.S. military commitment is calming Saudi Arabia. Sunique 18 of the German Institute on Global Studies explains that as American commitment declines to the region, Saudi assertiveness and militarization increase as a direct result. Indeed, Rupert 17 of the Century Foundation explains that due to their profound fear and anxiety about Iranian hegemony when Obama disengaged from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia adopted a hardline aggressive foreign policy, starting a war and imposing blockades. Sunique warns that Iran challenges the Saudi leadership's legitimacy through its alternative forms of government, concluding that Saudi Arabia is willing to push back against any change to their power. 2C18 of Princeton University furthers that today, because Saudi leaders feel that they're the last Arab country standing in the way of total Iranian regional dominance, they believe that any compromise is an acquiescence to Iran's regional power. Thus, McInnes 17 of the Daily Beast writes that if America reduced its military presence, Gulf states would be forced to contain Iranian influence themselves, concluding that because Saudi Arabia would not allow an Iranian proxy on their border, Saudi Arabia would fund their own Sunni proxy forces to fight Iran. History agrees. Goldenberg 17 of Foreign Policy confirms that empirically a lack of trust in the U.S. led the Saudis to act more aggressively on their own out of a position of insecurity, arming groups in Syria, intervening in Bahrain, and launching their intervention into Yemen. Overall, Lova 18 of the European Council on Foreign Relations finds that there are 5 potential proxy conflict flashpoints across the Persian Gulf, including Qatar, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Any conflict escalation risks the lives of millions. As the NRC 20 quantifies, that any escalation in regional conflict would be deadly for aid lifelines on the brink of collapse, putting 42 million aid-dependent civilians at risk of death. Contention 2 is global destabilization. Right now, the U.S. has shown strong support for our allies. Farouk 20 of Stanford University reports that after the Soleimani strike, U.S. credibility is renewed, even deepening cooperation with Saudi Arabia. However, should the U.S. pull from the Gulf, Cook 19 of Foreign Policy explains that reducing U.S. presence would have global ramifications because it would force our allies to doubt the reliability of the U.S., weakening our global alliances and partnerships that are required to compete with geopolitical rivals. The Middle East is key for American power. Trofimov 19 of the Wall Street Journal writes that global leaders are watching America's behavior in the Middle East, with the region viewed as a litmus test for American power around the world. Unfortunately, Trofimov concludes if the U.S. withdraws from the region, geopolitical rivals will expand. Russia will move into Ukraine, and China will expand in the South China Sea. Thus, there are 2 nuclear conflict scenarios that will erupt post-American withdrawal. First is Ukrainian invasion. Stanyanova 19 of Foreign Policy reports that Russia has always wanted to take control of Ukraine, as it will both secure pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine and also block the country's Euro-Atlantic integration. Moreover, Model 18 of the Atlantic Council explains that although the faltering Russian economy cannot sustain a war, Putin cannot fathom the prospects of a good war going bad because he believes that Russia is strong. Worse, in a bid to strengthen his legitimacy, his inner circle would easily convince him that a quick strike is imperative. Unfortunately, Model continues that if Russia invaded Ukraine, tens of thousands would die. Ultimately, the U.S. would surely get involved, prolonging the war and separating Russia from the international economy. Economic disaster from the war would cause state failure within Russia. Fisher 15 of Vox furthers that a Ukrainian invasion would likely become a larger conflict, including that small war would escalate to nuclear conflict due to Russia's low bar for nuclear weapon use and because Putin is more dangerous than any Soviet leader since Stalin. Second is the South China Sea. Romanok 19 of the Japan Times indicates that China's goal is to expand militarily and economically into the South China Sea. Unfortunately, Owens 19 of the National Interest finds that Chinese expansion in the South China Sea threatens the U.S. core economic and security interests, leading America to increase its military position in strength in order to combat China. Problematically, Kulaki 16 of the UCS explains that a lack of trust between the two could lead the U.S. or China to inadvertently escalate skirmishes to large military confrontations, concluding that one could launch a retaliatory nuclear strike if the other were to launch conventionally. Overall, Bresson 17 of Forbes quantifies that even a limited nuclear exchange would set off a global famine that would kill 2 billion people and effectively end human civilization by creating a nuclear winter that would block all sunlight, thus we negate.
Do you mind if I take flex prep to just ask one question?
Sure.
Did you read redeployment? You were kind of cutting out a little for me.
We didn't read redeployment in case.
Oh, okay. We're all good. That was 7.
Okay. Is everyone ready for me to start constructive? Cool. Time will start now. We affirm contention 1 is climate change. Crawford 19 writes that reducing the U.S. military in the Persian Gulf helps combat climate change due to the extremely high amounts of fossil fuels from U.S. military bases. Furthermore, closed bases would be available for reforestation to take the carbon out of the air because warming leads to resource scarcity. It exacerbates resource wars and conflict, which Jacobson 19 concludes that just less than a degree of warming would kill 153 million people. Contention 2 is regionalism. The U.S. military is a barrier to Gulf regional alliances. Carlin 19 finds the U.S. bases are strategically placed to enforce what is good for Washington, even at the cost for Arab rulers. Indeed, Zunes writes that in order to ensure allies grant them a foothold in the region, the U.S. explicitly wages war and makes it so our allies need us for protection. Ashford 18 furthers that the U.S. engages in a form of underbalancing, destabilizing regional cooperation. Specifically, the U.S. does this in two key ways. First, by exacerbating divides. The U.S. is a symbol of Western imperialism, one rejected by the Gulf. Byman 16 writes that deep anti-American sentiment weakens the stability of U.S. allies. U.S. troops represent the highest form of betrayal, preventing regional cooperation. Bowman 12 furthers that the U.S. military is a leading source of radicalism in the Gulf, with a large presence being counterproductive. Indeed, Beaver concludes that minimal U.S. military presence would allow regional actors to prosper on their own without having to reject one another due to ties with the U.S. But second is undermining multilateralism. Young 20 explains that the U.S. military creates one-on-one diplomacy with individual nations, as opposed to multilateral talks. This has bred mistrust between Gulf states that enhances miscommunication due to a lack of diplomacy between neighbors. Indeed, Benjamin 19 analyzed that because the U.S. military sends a signal that forces the best method for de-escalation, the marginalization of diplomacy costs its influence, access, and bargaining power. Because of this, Valkill 18 concludes that Gulf states suffer internal tensions that make regional organizations like the GCC remain too constrained to use tools for de-escalation. For these two reasons, Carlin concludes that a reduction in the U.S. military in the Gulf would allow regional actors to cooperate to solve regional problems. With a minimal presence, the U.S. would also turn to regionalism, as Bowman finds that prior to the Gulf War in 1989, the U.S. worked through its regional alliances in lieu of a large presence, checking threats to key interests it still cares about. The impact is preventing regional conflict. Korsman 18 finds that lack of Arabian unity has eroded regional deterrence, pushing Iran to expand. However, Long 19 writes that a regional pact would allow for Iranian allies such as Oman to bring Iran to the table as regional deterrence is restrained. That's why Tapsin 18 explains that the root cause of Middle Eastern conflict is the drastic divide across the Gulf. Velasco 13 quantifies that regional organizations are 6.7 times more effective than regional actors at achieving diplomacy. Welsh 20 confirms that diplomacy led by our Arab allies in Iran, not the US, would lead to a mutual Gulf security deal that brings both sides to amicable agreements for de-escalation. Overall, Harrison 17 finds that continued aggression will intensify and increase the number of proxy conflicts all across the Arab world, with Bilal furthering that this spills over into a regional war. Barr 13 concludes that Middle Eastern war would push states to acquire nuclear weapons with faulty command control in escalatory situations, leading to miscalculation in a nuclear war. Even if conflict is inevitable, these factors prolong conflicts. As Reagan quantifies, the U.S. intervention reduces the probability of conflict resolution by over 1,000%, but war is 76% shorter when accompanied by diplomacy. Contention 3 is redirecting aid. The U.S. military pulls aid funding away from where it's needed most. Cadell 12 writes that the U.S. directs a third of its aid budget towards states housing U.S. military as a political tool instead of to countries that needed the most. Glasser 17 furthers that 18% of aid budgeting goes to securing bases access alone for the military. Luckily, Cadell found that the U.S. began retreating from Iraq in 2011. Aid to the region decreased by 7%, as aid going to combating actual poverty and disease in Africa increased by 6%. Gauze 19 furthers that a pullout of the Gulf would save 15% of the defense budget, which Borgen 19 explains would go to aid and triple the effects of current underfunded projects that give food to over 50 million people and saved over 9.5 million lives every year from HIV.
Can we call for some cards? Can we see the first Byman in your first one about divides? Can we see when we decreased in 2011, the aid went to Africa? And then if we decrease the budget by 15%, the new money would go to aid.
Yeah, I'll get you all of that. Hang on a sec, I'm just loading the doc because my computer crashed earlier.
That's fine. We'll start prep when we get the cards.
Yeah. Okay, it should be sent.
Okay, we got it. Starting now.
Jackson, you want to call?
Sure.
Okay, that's 10 seconds used. Can we also see bar at the end of C2?
Yeah.
Can we also see long in C2? Sorry.
Don't worry, I'll get you every card. Sent over.
Starting prep now. That's another 40 use, so then 50 use total. Good for cross.
Yeah, you can have the first question.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's talk about your third contention about aid. So like, what humanitarian aid are we sending to Saudi Arabia right now?
To Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
If you call for the evidence, it quantifies how much we're giving overall to the region in general. We specify, however, just to have our military presence there, we're spending 15% of our defense budget.
So where in the Middle East are we sending aid? Because like I would say we're probably not sending aid to Saudi Arabia because they're oil rich. So like where are we sending?
Right. It would probably be to countries like Bahrain, Qatar, and places that are having financial struggles. Can I take a question?
We're sending aid to Qatar, just to clarify.
Our evidence indicates we're sending them to nations that need humanitarian aid. Yeah, Qatar would be one of them.
Qatar needs. You can have a question.
Okay, so let's talk about your contention too on Russian expansion. What needs to happen for Putin's inner circle to be able to convince him that a quick strike is needed?
What do you mean what is needed?
Yeah, like at what point would they be able to justify to Putin that the U.S. that would like allow them to be able to rationalize it.
So the justification is that when the US pulls out of the Middle East, the Travamov evidence says that global leaders think that the US is backing away from our allies in the global stage, which allows the inner circle to convince him to strike into Ukraine.
So explain to me the link between the US pulling out of the Persian Gulf allows them to justify expansion into somewhere else that isn't the Persian Gulf.
Well, the Travamov evidence says that the Middle East is the litmus test for American power. So when we decrease it there,
What does that mean? Litmus test. We have bases and military presence almost everywhere else in the world. Why is the Persian Gulf specifically a litmus test?
Military presence to like one of our allies like Saudi Arabia, and we're pulling out from the Middle East, which is where we've always shown our greatest strength. That shows to Russia that we're stepping back from the global stage, and that allows them to expand. Can I say
how does our interaction with Saudi Arabia affect Russia's decision-making calculus to expand into somewhere like Ukraine?
Pulling out from the Middle East, which causes A, our allies not to trust the US reliability anymore, but B, Russia sees the US power is going down. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, so let's talk about your first argument about divides, right? So you read this like Byman evidence that says it like destroys cooperation between countries in the GCC, right? So what does an AF world look like?
An AF world is a world in which we don't have enough military presence in all of the Gulf states that cause them to have mistrust between each other. They're going to feel like it's up to them regionally to be able to figure out their disputes.
So if all GCC countries have US military presence in them and they're all supported by the US, why do they not form together? And like, why do they suddenly come together when the US leaves?
Can you re-ask the question?
Why do all these countries historically, since they haven't been able to get along together, why do they all suddenly just come together at a big table once the US leaves?
Because they're no longer able to use ideological divides as a justification to not get along with each other, because now they have to worry about their security threats.
Oh, okay.
Okay, let's cross.
We'll run some prep starting now. That's a minute total use. Actually, no, minute 10 use, sorry. Okay, everyone good? Okay. It'll be contention 1, contention 3, contention 2. Just because it'll undercover otherwise. Stronger contention. What about climate change? True responses here. First of all, climate change is not needed because Fork and 14 finds that because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for more than a century, it's almost impossible to remove at the current levels, which means they ultimately prefer all the other impacts because they don't even solve for this in the long term. And you should prioritize poverty reduction and conflict alleviation in the first place because that's the only way that we can ensure that we live in the interim. But then second of all, conflict is what causes emission and damage. As Hussein actually for the Intercept writes that warfare is easily the most carbon intensive activity, which is why during the Afghan and Iraq wars, the war causes massive carbon emissions, deforestation, and toxic munitions poisoning local populations. This means that we link in with proxy conflicts, and we outweigh because we link it to 5 proxy conflicts, which means that there's on net more militarization and fossil fuel emissions, which means that we link in. With that, go to their third contention about aid. 2 major responses here. First of all, the Carnegie Endowment writes as of last year that when we withdrew from Iraq, the US aid virtually stopped to Iraq, and literally there is no other country in the GCC or any of our allies that would need aid. Like, we're not going to give aid to like Kuwait or Qatar, which means that there's no aid to even divert in the first place. And second of all, aid won't even need to be redirected to Africa, as Trump is anti-foreign aid. As Mason 24 Reuters explains that Trump voted to cut foreign aid by another 20% in his aid budget, which has 3 implications. First, Trump sees this as the golden opportunity to cut aid. Second, Trump also sees this as a mechanism to bolster America first. But then third, the entire government, not just Trump, has an interest in prioritizing the domestic people and the economy, which is especially pertinent during the coronavirus. That means that there's no probability to aid going to Africa. With that, go to their second contention about the GCC. Numerous responses at the top. First of all, any link defense or term that we read on their case takes out any solvency in their case, because if one side doesn't come to the table, it doesn't matter if Saudi Arabia or Iran does, because the other side doesn't want to come to the table, or the GCC. But then second of all, the status quo solves for diplomacy, because Kane 20 explains last week that it's impossible that the technical level discussion to coordinate, it is possible that the technical level discussion to coordinate medical and scientific efforts to combat the coronavirus could open up a much needed diplomatic dialogue for reducing tension in the region in the future. The conflict and instability plagued Middle East could turn the coronavirus crisis into an opportunity. This has two implications on their case. First of all, the status quo solves. We don't even need to affirm their case to get diplomacy. But then second of all, if we win a risk that conflict escalates without the United States, there is no peace, which means that if you win any risk in the round, that means we win. And third of all, we short circuit their entire case, because if a conflict breaks out anywhere, there's no peace, because of the cynic evidence that says that the competition is existential, which will apply with the terms that I'm going to read later. But then fourth of all, their long evidence, which we called for on their second warrant, explains that there are tensions between Saudi Arabia and UAE, which means that they never prove that they changed. That means that they don't even link to their first warrant, because Saudi Arabia and the UAE are always going to have those types of tensions. But then fifth of all, you can turn it, because Paul Clancy for the Washington Institute explains that if we were to pull our commitments in the region, our allies would get frightened and over-exaggerate the Iranian threat, causing them to tackle problems that are beyond their capabilities and exacerbating conflict. This has three implications to the round. First of all, that means that there's more proxy conflicts, and this links into the impact that they talk about. And in fact, it magnifies all the impacts, because there's way more actors doing way more proxy conflicts. But second of all, there's no diplomacy. I already explained there earlier about how there's a short circuit. But then third of all, this also precludes their GCC diplomacy, because it takes a long time to build trust in coalitions. But if short-term aggression occurs, then diplomacy fails in the long term. And this is why you should prefer our analysis on this term, because all of their evidence is indicative of a world in which the United States still has a security guarantee. However, without the security guarantee in our world, the foreign policy uniquely changes to be reactionary. But then sixth of all, you can turn it, because Luck 18 for the CSM explains that if domestic dissenters in Saudi Arabia see the U.S. security relationship disintegrating, the Saudis will grow skeptical of existing leadership, potentially challenging the prince's hold of power. That's why Lynch 16 continues that when domestic audiences question policy failures from the prince, the Saudis seek to distract regional and domestic audiences with aggressive foreign policy, lashing out in proxy war. This outweighs for two reasons. First of all, it short circuits GCC diplomacy, because GCC diplomacy doesn't solve internal Saudi fracturing. It doesn't matter what the GCC and Iran do to ease tensions if Saudis internally are fractured, causing them to lash out independently. But then second of all, prefer our analysis, because even though they're going to diplomacy right now, our analysis takes into account a world and without the U.S. security guarantee, theirs doesn't.
Okay, I'm going to frontline my entire case, and then I'll go to their case. I'm going to send an email of what I'm going to be reading.
Are you spreading?
No.
Okay.
It's going to be what most people call PF speed. So I'm not going to be going like overly fast, and I'm going to send the rhetoric of what I'm going to be reading off of on the email chain once I get to the net case. Okay, the email should be sent. Did everyone get it?
Give me a sec.
Yeah, of course.
This is in response to our case, right?
Yeah, but I'm going to frontline first.
Okay.
Everyone ready? Okay. On my case, they really messed up. They say climate change inevitable, but they don't contest that climate change causes regional resource scarcity, which inevitably causes war. That means conflict is inevitable in the long term. Neither side can always solve for it, which means you'll always prefer regionalism for two reasons. First, regional actors are the only ones that can focus on actual regional problem solving with the root cause of things like climate change by avoiding things like resource scarcity. But second, regional coalitions are the only one that would have incentive to combat the economic fallout of climate change. The United States never has an incentive. It's literally do or die for the United States. They messed up. Go to my second contention. They read two terms. The only things I need to frontline. The first term is that our allies get more emboldened. That's an extension of their C1. We can address it there. Then they say Saudi Arabia needs to turn diversionary to distract its public. But first, Saudi Arabia can use any other scapegoat to distract its public. Second, Saudi Arabian leadership can probably paint the U.S. leaving as a political victory, saying they're pushing against U.S. imperialism. There's no reason they need to distract their public. But third, we argue that if we want to turn on their C1 on Iran quells, that becomes a political victory for Saudi Arabia, and they don't need to turn to destabilizing policies. Go to their case. start off with an overview on both contention. Ocean 20 explains that should the U.S. pullout would allow China, India, Japan, and Russia to fill in, sparking a massive diversification of security agreements. Crucially, Ocean 20 finds these replacements would not pick sides in the regional conflict like the U.S. has. As today, team explains that they use investment-based leverage to work towards regional cooperations, but on their C1 on uniqueness. Has 318 explains that Saudi, Sunnis, and Iran Shiites have historically been able to move past ideological divides coexisting during the majority of their history, especially during the 70s. Western 20 further said from 2001 to 2011, Saudi Arabia and Iran worked together and had no active conflict for over a decade. We'll link it below. Then their argument is twofold. It's about Iran, it's about Saudi. On Iran, turn it. Only 19 explains that below its surface, Iran's political establishment is open to diplomatic solutions to regional problems. However, Jones 11 writes to surround Iran militarily as strengthened political hardliners in Iran, pushing them towards militarism. Fortunately, we saw was berserker rights that allowing regional forces to take action. Absent U.S. control would push Iran to switch away from hard power to soft power, as seen in both empirically Iran and Iraq and Lebanon. They turn it again. War with Iran is inevitable. Dreyfus 19 explains that war with Iran could set off an explosion of rally around the flag effect. And Chase 20 explains that Trump feels that it'll help him win the election. If Iran prevents this, is working further, so we would need bases and troops in Qatar and Saudi Arabia in order to go to war with Iran. Over Ashbar finds that this inevitable conflict will result with Trump turning to nuclear weapons to prevent American death, which sinks into their extinction scenario. Then turn it again. Deterrence is failing. FAS explains that Iran is stockpiling reserves of chemical and biological weapons, planning to push the United States out of the goal. Western turn it further that Iran intends to start war with the U.S. to prevent the 2020 election defeat they believe worked in 1980. Sandberg away concludes modern chemical weapons have self-replication and weapons regarding self-replication and range risking extinction. Even if Iran is negotiating now, we say that's a short-term attempt for Iran to gain time to prepare this advance. Then on Saudi Arabia, turn in late 19 explains the U.S. military gives our allies a blank check over our adversaries, putting them against each other. Saudi Arabia alone uses this to justify 61 terrorist organizations and turn to recognize. Luckily, Lane knows that reducing American support would end ally incentives to turn towards violence. Empirically, this is the only empirical analysis in the round. Parsi 20 reports received lack incentive of U.S. military commitment caused the Saudi coalition in Yemen to decrease airstrikes by 80%, stopping all casualties for a short period. South 19 confirms the U.S. military commitments create perceived incentives in U.S. allies to adopt destabilizing policies towards Libya, Qatar, Yemen, and Palestine. And then turn it again because right now, Latina states that Saudi Arabia depends on the U.S. for munitions. Its forces will be immediately grounded if the U.S. halted military support. This is key, as of Dawn 19 finds that Saudi Arabia has violated ceasefire negotiations over 1,000 times in a month, killing any chance of peace in Yemen alone. Patrick team explains that further the conflict threatens to go 14 million people through starvation. This implicates the proxy wars that are happening right now, which are non-unique, so you try and die for us. Then on global destabilization, first on Russia, the Washington Post finds that Russia lacks the monetary ability to expand because they're crippled by sanctions and coronavirus has crashed their economy. Second, European states have their own nuclear weapons, their own umbrella checks a Russian scenario. But then turn to March 2017 explains that hegemonic decline is inevitable due to increased management costs that outweigh benefits. Trends through the Obama and Bush administration prove costs are becoming too high. At the same time, China and Russia are rising fast to combat U.S. hegemonic control. Multipolarity is inevitable. The U.S. can go down fast and peacefully or by slow, violent transitions. 2015 confirms that while China is willing to engage with the U.S. to rebase multipolarity, U.S. dominance forces China to adopt a hard-edge approach, inevitably turning Chinese insecurity into a full-on arms race. For example, President Xi finds that to combat U.S. hegemony, China's turn towards space militarization to get ahead of Contending. For the U.S. hegemonic military presence has pushed Russia to join China in cooperative space operations. Gillard finds that space militarization will cause space debris to cloud the orbit, rendering satellites ineffective for many states, establishing a clear power imbalance that sparks mass nuclear proliferation and war. You can have the first question, Cross.
Actually, can we see Preston and O'Connor?
Yeah, I got you.
Well, we're finding that for you. Can we see the card that Putin's inner alliance pushes him to do a quick strike?
Sure.
I sent both of them.
Can we just look at the cards during cross because we're both sending Ev anyway?
Yeah, that's good.
All right, I see. Okay, are we good for cross?
Yeah, you can have the first question.
Okay. Why would Iran use biological weapons when coronavirus just completely messed up their economy?
Well, actually, that kind of bolsters my argument. If Iran literally just witnessed the massive depth and the effect that chemical and biological effects could possibly have at a population, wouldn't that actually increase their incentive to use them?
The thing with biological weapons, though, is that they attack with impunity, right? So it'll attack their population too.
No. They don't share a water supply with Saudi with like U.S. like they can differentiate where they place them. For example, they use it to cause a cholera epidemic in Yemen, but as far as I know, Iran's not facing a cholera epidemic.
And so, okay, wait a minute. What types of biological weapons would Iran use? What do they have stockpiled right now?
I don't know. I don't think that's information that's disclosed to the general public. I don't think any state is out there like, here are the chemical weapons I have.
Just disease, right?
Huh?
Like you said, cholera, right? It's some sort of contagious disease, right?
Probably.
Yeah, okay, so it would affect their own citizens too.
Disease or a virus. Yeah,
Okay.
but they don't think that. Like, you say that nuclear war leads to extinction. If people knew that their actions resulted in them getting hurt, neither of us would have a case. You'd realize that, right?
No.
You tell me nuclear war leads to extinction. That also hurts the US. So why would the US use nukes? You see, questions like those take out both of our offense and eventually make debate useless.
Those are two totally different things. Your argument,
They're different, but your like analysis applies to both.
Your argument is that Iran will intentionally use the biological weapon. My argument there is that they're not going to because they know it'll kill their citizens. The United States, that is a miscalculation scenario. It's not that they're consciously nuking Russia.
And I argue that this is also a miscalculation on Iran's part. They miscalculate thinking that they wouldn't be affected by biological or chemical weapons.
How can you just release like a new coronavirus part 2 on accident?
Not on accident. I'd argue the miscalculation doesn't come from whether or not they decide to use it. It comes from their interpretation of the perceived or expected result of the use of chemical and biological weapons. For example, Saddam Hussein used biological and chemical weapons.
Yeah, because he didn't care about his population. But now the
I don't think Iran does either. Iran's being so aggressive, they're willing to get like sanctioned by the entire international community.
The Iranian parliament just had like the lowest legitimacy ever because no one came out to vote because of Corona. They're literally facing an existential crisis right now.
Coronavirus is going to be gone in like a year. Like, okay, we'll push the time frame of our arguments back a year. Like, why does that matter?
I got a question.
Okay, so answer that question. Like, you keep bringing up coronavirus and you brought it up as an example here. So can we just push all offense to the round like a year later?
What? No.
Why not? Like, coronavirus is going to be over.
Oh, wait, you want to do impacts to coronavirus?
What? No, you read coronavirus as like defense here. Then you just read on my case. Then you just brought up coronavirus again. Can we just agree to push back all arguments like a year then, considering coronavirus is short term?
And that's also time.
Okay.
We'll run prep. Start. It's another 113-ish. So 45 left. Yeah. So it's going to be quickly. Actually, no, it's going to go af neg C2 neg C1. Does that work with everything?
Wait, what is it? You cut out for like 2 seconds for me.
It's af neg C2 neg C1.
Okay.
Okay. Start on the af case. They try to make this argument that the regionalism is the only way to solve back for the problem.
The problem with this argument is that the round is essentially over when Alex does not frontline the Kane evidence that explains that coronavirus in the status quo is leading towards long-term diplomacy. He also concedes the two implications. The first is that the status quo is solving back for all the regional consequences, but B, any risk of offense for the negative is a reason to vote there, because insofar as the status quo is solving for regionalism because of coronavirus, any risk that Saudi Arabia expands or Iran expands is a reason why that diplomacy fails. Moreover, on the Pollock turn, they say it's a cross-app of case. No, it isn't. The Pollock evidence specifically says that allies become scared when the US lashes out. It's not Saudi Arabia, it's the rest of the GCC. The implication is pretty clear. A, it outweighs their entire case because it means more conflict because all these other actors are starting conflict. But B, it short circuits all this trust argument because insofar as in the short term they're aggressive, they can't build up the long-term trust to solve back for all the conflicts. But third, it also outweighs because it short circuits their argument because there's no diplomacy insofar as all the GCC are escalating into conflict. At that point, you can't really vote on the app case. Go to our case. On our second contention about global destabilization, quick, they read this term that says China's going to push for space militarization. Three responses here. The first is that China's main goal to push back against the United States is the South China Sea, which is the first place they're going to expand. But second, space militarization is going to be non-unique in the end, which means that China's already expanding the status quo. But third, they have no clear implication of this argument on why it outweighs any argument. Don't let Jackson do it in second summary. But then on our first contention about proxy wars, they read a lot of responses. First, they say that China's going to do investments. China's already doing investments through the BRI in the region, which means they're already filling in. But second, their argument is that they can move past divides. That's our argument. They moved past the divides. No. Our argument from the McInnes evidence is that when the US leaves, they're not able to move past divides and they actually escalate into conflict. Then they read 5 turns. The first argument is that Iran is going to militarize trade. Two reasons why Iran is going to escalate either way. First, they want to get into Iraqi oil fields to get more money. But second, they want to defend against Israel, which is why they're going to expand either way. Their next argument is that US-Iran war is going to happen either way. What Zuckerman 20 finds 3 days ago is that the US is unwilling to move into conflict with Iran, which postdates all of their evidence because of the coronavirus. Their next argument is that Iran is going to use biochemical weapons. There's no warrant why this is true. They say that it's not a miscalculation. They just accidentally use it. There's no warrant how you actually release a biological weapon accidentally. We would say that biological weapons are specifically bad for Iran. Clearly, the coronavirus is killing them right now. Their last 2 arguments are pretty bad as well. Their first argument is that Saudi decreases violence. They missed the Goldenberg evidence that explains that Saudi Arabia specifically lashes out when the US leaves. That the warrant comes from the 2C evidence from cases that explains that they're never willing to do diplomacy because they're the only state left to stop Iran. Their last argument is that the US stops military support and they can't fight. The argument is about arms sales. It's not about military presence. Let's go to extension because the rest of it is dropped. The Sunni evidence explains that when the US commitment decreases, Saudi Arabian aggression increases. The McInnes evidence, which I already extended, explains that they're going to fund more proxy wars, which leads to 42 million people to die because there's 5 new conflicts. This is a short circuit on all of their diplomacy arguments because insofar as Saudi Arabia aggresses, none of the GCC or Iran is willing to do diplomacy because they're starting new wars.
Jackson, do you need to take prep time?
Yeah, let's take prep. We'll start it once I call you. I believe we've only used 7 seconds thus far.
Yeah.
Okay, start time now. We have 3 seconds remaining. So the order is going to be their case and then on to our case.
Did you say 3 seconds left?
Pardon?
Did you say 3 seconds left?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Is anybody not ready? Time will start now. Starting the overview that we read to you on fill in which once the United States leaves the region, it's going to cause actors like India, Japan, and China all to fill into the region, increase their economic investment into it, and ensure regional stability. The only thing they say is that China is already investing into the region right now. What Romani 18 indicates is that large states like Saudi Arabia are rejecting Chinese investment because they prefer their alliance with the United States and they don't want to upset them. That's what they'd be doing by accepting Chinese aid. At that point, they functionally can see the rest of the overview that once the U.S. leaves, they fill in, cause instability, which takes out the term they extend on our case. With that, go to the rest of their contention 1. First turn you're going to be extending is the turn on US-Iran war, which we explained to you that Trump is going to start a war with Iran because he believes it's going to cause a rally around the flag effect, which wins him the presidency. Because he wants to justify, because he wants to protect our troops that are in the region, he's going to result to using nukes to be able to take out Iran, which ultimately causes nuclear debris clouds, which ultimately leads to extinction. The only response they make is that the US is unwilling to fight a conflict right now because of coronavirus. Actually, this amplifies our argument. What coronavirus has done is decrease Trump's popularity, increasing the Trump's probability that he's going to go to war to rise his popularity. So then go to our turn that we read to you on Iran stockpiling chemical weapons to kick the United States out. All they say is that there's no warrant. Our warrant is incredibly clear and we read in rebuttal. Iran is developing biological and chemical weapons to be able to kick the United States out. That's going to happen close to the presidency as well, which also links to extinction as well. All they say is no warrant. That doesn't respond to the argument. It goes clean conceded. With that, go to their contention 2 on global destabilization. Here's where you're going to be voting for us. We read you a turn that China perceives U.S. military hegemony as a reason that they're militarizing space right now. The only side that risks that, you're going to concede their link that U.S. pullout means they perceive the U.S. declines in their military hegemony. That means China no longer has a reason to pursue space militarization. They give 3 responses. First, they say South China Sea is the main place for military expansion. That's non-responsive. We're telling you that they're expanding into space right now, which risks miscalculation and which risks space debris, which could take out satellites and ultimately would lead to military conflicts which go to extinction because there's no second Their second response is that space is not unique. No, it's not true. Our cards explicitly indicate that they are only militarizing right now because of the US's military hegemony. And then they say there's no implication. Read the document. There's clearly an implication, and I just extend the argument there. With that, go to our case. On our contention 2 on regionalism, go to our second one on undermining multilateralism. We explain to you that because the U.S. prefers to do one-on-one diplomacy, they stop multilateralism from being able to succeed within the Gulf. The only response they extend is that coronavirus is going to be causing diplomacy in the long run. However, 2 responses. First, coronavirus is inherently short-term. As Alex tells you in Cross, it's probably going to end in a year. That means diplomacy is not going to be able to extend after that. And second, climate change is in the long term is going to cause resource wars, which ultimately non-unique the impact of war, which takes out non-unique the impact of war. At that point, once you allow multilateralism and regionalism to take hold in the region, you're going to allow it's going to cause states to pursue regional conflicts, which causes them to nuclearize and ultimately leads to extinction. Remember, the overview takes out the term they read because it causes regional stability.
Okay, y'all good for Cross?
Yeah.
Yeah, y'all can have the first question.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's talk about this Ulrichsen China fill-in economic thing, right?
Yes,
so you
sir.
Argument that both countries can't accept Chinese aid in the status quo because
they're choosing not.
They want to prioritize the relationship with the U.S., right?
So they don't go all in with Chinese investment. Also, the argument isn't just about China. China's one of 4 actors we name.
Okay, so for example, why did Saudi Arabia join the BRI if they're so scared about angering the US?
Because they know there's a possibility that they can engage with China in the long term. Our argument is right now they're rejecting a lot of the investment.
Oh, wait, so they're rejecting BRI investment in the status quo. Why did they join it?
They joined the BRI. There could be a million reasons they joined the BRI, right? One, they need to legitimize, MBS needs to legitimize themselves domestically. Second of all, they probably just want better relations with China in general. But third of all, that doesn't interact with our argument. Even if they joined the initiative, we all debated the BRI topic. Everyone knows the overview that was read on NEG. Joining the BRI doesn't mean anything.
Okay, sure. You can have a question.
Okay, so your argument is that COVID leads to long-term diplomacy, right?
Yep.
Why doesn't that just take out your case?
What? It's saying that
the opportunity for
so right now with the US in the region, coronavirus is leading to a long-term stability, which is why the second implication says that if the US pulls out, any risk of like any actor expanding, for example, Saudi Arabia lashing out, destroys that diplomacy.
Okay, does your evidence take into account the possibility of fill-in?
What?
Your evidence doesn't take into account fill-in, does it?
From 2 days ago.
Wait, which
Dude, I don't care if it was 2 days ago or 2 years ago. Does it take into account fill-in?
which evidence? Like
The evidence that you just told me you read on COVID.
coronavirus?
Like you said your second implication is that if the US leaves, there's no chance of regionalism. Does that evidence take into account fill-in?
Okay, wait a minute. Where did you ever read that fill-in leads to diplomacy? You didn't.
That's the entire overview.
Like, would you like to read
The
it?
overview doesn't link to the argument that the status quo is doing diplomacy. So at
I'm
worst,
aware of that.
wait, so what is your argument?
Diplomacy exists. Like, our argument is that once all of our allies fill in, that also causes diplomacy. Even if you read the uniqueness that diplomacy is happening right now, we also cause diplomacy through fill in.
Which means the overview is a non-unique at worst and a turn at best if we beat your COVID argument. But either way, it's not responding to my argument. Does your evidence that when the US leaves, everything collapses, even take into account the idea of fill-in or the long-term geopolitical implications?
No, because that's not very likely at all. No scholar writes about that.
Can we have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about like this bio weapon. So you say that Iran is stockpiling them. Why would they ever use them? Like, sure, they're stockpiling them.
To
Why
stop the US election.
to stop the US election?
Yeah, it's something they thought they did in the 1980s and they want to do now. We read you evidence on it.
Okay. We'll run the last 40. Wait, can we see the Romani evidence quick?
Romani, yeah.
Ron Jackson, Red and Summer.
It's sent.
Okay, we'll start prep when we get it.
Jackson, you want to call?
Starting now. Okay, that's our prep. Okay.
I guess their case, our case. Everyone good? Start at the top of their case. They drop the Kane evidence in rebuttal, which talks about how current efforts to have short-term solvency because of the coronavirus are going to catalyze long-term change, and there's the only hope for long-term change there. They stand two things. First of all, they say that it's short-term and it's not going to happen. No, the evidence is explicit in saying that it could catalyze long-term change. But then second of all, they say that climate change means that there's resources wars. No, that's way in the long term. We are just talking about solving for proxy wars in the first time. But even if you don't buy that, it's not in rebuttal, which means that you don't extend the thing that they say in second summary. There are two implications of the round. First of all, there is status quo diplomacy, which means that you don't even need to look to their case or any of their terms because we're solving the status quo. But then the second of all is that if we win a risk of offense on anything of even a turn or case, that means that we turn their case and that leads to proxy wars. With that, let's go to their case. They try to extend it. They don't even extend their case, don't even give them their case, but you can extend the turn, which goes dropped. Pollock explains that our allies get super scared when we're not there and they over-exaggerate the Iranian threat. That's exactly why they would go and fund more proxy wars. There's three implications. First of all, we outweigh because there's more conflict, because when there's more people, there's more conflict. That means more proxy wars. But then second of all, it short circuits all of the trust arguments because the only way you can get long-term trust is if they're not having proxy wars. With that, let's go to our case. On our contention two, really quickly, about their militarization turn. Three responses here. First of all, there's no extension of the turn there's no like clarity at all whatsoever. But then second of all, they don't actually extend the turn. They just like extend the general idea of it. But then third of all, there's no extension of the impact. But then fourth of all, if the United States is always going to be a hegemonic power, China is still going to want to do space militarization, which means that it's non-unique. They never respond to that. With that, let's go to our contention two. They extend a few things. First of all, they talk about the overview, but McInnes says that we short circuit the overview because before they even fill in, they fund the proxy, which causes the war. But then second of all, they never prove that fill in leads to diplomacy. And third of all, their card literally says that they're moving towards China right now. But then second of all, they talk about US-Iran war. But as of 3 days ago, Zuckerman says that Trump views it as unpopular, which is why he's never going to go to war. But then third, they talk about biological weapons. They drop the argument that there's no reason as to why Iran would do a biological weapon when they're being so impacted by Corona. At that point, you can say Sunik, McInnes, and Tusi, which all explains that Saudi Arabia would lash out against Iran, which is an independent link into war, which the NRC explains would kill 42 million people on impact. The reason why this outweighs is because Saudi Arabia views Iran as an existential threat, which means that before the fill-in can even happen, they go to war on their northern border with them funding the proxies. And the warrant comes from Tusi, which explains that they view themselves as the last actor left in the region to combat Iran, which means that before diplomacy can even happen, Saudi Arabia gets scared, our allies get scared, which is why I negate.
Okay, it's going to be my case, their case. Actually, no, it's going to start under C2, then it'll go my case, their case. Everyone ready? This round is super simple. They extend three things in final focus on our turn under C2. First, they say there's no clarity. I don't even know what that means. We clarify everything. Second, they say we don't extend it. Yeah, we do extend it. Third, they say there's no impact. We literally link it to extinction. I don't know what impact they want. Fourth, they say U.S. hedge is non-unique, but we didn't read defense on them saying U.S. hedge goes down, which means you can extend their link, which Jackson did extend in summary, which is that when the U.S. pulls out of the Middle East, it's perceived as a destruction of United States military dominance all over the rest of the world. We tell you that's key because existing U.S. military dominance forces China and Russia to adopt more hardline approaches. For example, China is militarizing in space, which is going to lead to massive amounts of space debris that crash satellites, which then lead to no communication on Earth, causes miscalculation, results in nuclear war. Literally 99% of the link on the turn is functionally conceded, and the rest of it is brand new responses in final focus because they didn't have any actual responses in summary. It is game over. You can literally click stop round on your ballot. This is it. Then let's go to the top of their case on the overview. They say conflict happens pre-fill-in, brand new and final focus, but also we say there's no explicit warranting, like investment can happen immediately. We tell you it would happen immediately. Then they say that there's no proof of it. There is proof. You have evidence. Then they say it's non-unique, but they drop a Romani evidence that it's not non-unique. They're rejecting investment because of the U.S., which means the rest of the link on the overview also goes conceded, which is when the U.S. leaves, multiple actors, not just China, which they don't read defense to fill in, immediately use their economic leverage to become mediators in the region, which creates regional conflict, which us back against all other offense in the round, and you can literally vote on any risk of our turn under C2. But then on US-Iran war, they say they have evidence that Trump views it as unpopular. It doesn't matter. They don't give a warrant. We tell you that Trump would go to war because it would distract from the population's views on coronavirus. We tell you that him going to war is perceived as something more popular for him than anything else. But if we pull out our troops, he can't justify nuclear strikes. On our case, the overview takes out their turns. They drop that implication. We win the overview. We win both cases. And you like literally pull trigger on a risk of turn on their sub point B. Or second contention. Good round, y'all.
Good round.
Okay, the decision is in. You guys want me to announce it, or you want to announce it?
Is Edina still in the room?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay, I can announce the decision then. It was a 3-0 decision for the pro. I guess I can go first, giving some feedback. At the end of the round, I think that it became really hard for me to make a decision because nobody really collapsed and everything just became like super blippy. And there was a lot of debates going on like everywhere on my flow. So like in instances like this, I just tend to vote on the path of least resistance for me, where I have to sort out the least amount of stuff and allow for like the least amount of my bias to enter, having to like sort it out on my own. So at that point, I vote on this like Chinese militarization turn on your second contention. I'm not entirely happy voting on that because I don't think it's the most fleshed out argument in the round, but it's also like the cleanest argument in the round for me to vote off of without having to intervene on my own. They basically say that like China's militarizing the status quo, whether that be space, whether that be whatever they say it may be. They say that that incentive is lost when the United States goes away, and that essentially they'd be preventing this catastrophic impact. Not my favorite argument that I voted on this tournament, but it's clean, it's there. The only response you guys really ever make is like, oh, there's no context, they don't like have a warrant, but like it's made clear enough to me at the end of the round for it to be a place I can vote off of. So yeah.
I can go next. My decision is similar in that I do find the clearest and cleanest place on my flow. Ultimately, I'm convinced by the pros regionalism argument. It's the place where it seems like there is the clearest impact framing for me. I think that withdrawal would boost stability in the region. And I don't think that the negative towards the end of the debate is doing a really good job of A, extending the internal links to their impact story, but B, explaining to me why regionalism wouldn't be able to solve the internal links to that impact story. That is to say, I don't really understand why conflict in the region couldn't be resolved by the multiple countries that could potentially fill in. That's the clearest place for me to vote. I do think that it would be easier if there was just better framing towards the end of the debate.
Yeah, I voted more kind of along the lines of the first judge. I thought the easiest place to vote was the space militarization turn. I think there needs to be more done against it, or you not focus, just ignore it, concede it, and then do more of like this super short-term framing or somehow weighing it in a different manner, because that I think is your only two options for the round. But that was the path of least resistance. I also think you guys kind of mishandled the overview a little bit, which kind of took out some of the things that you were going for.
Wait, just as like a question, what was the space militarization? Or is it just like US hedge, decrease in US hedge leads to China not expanding? Okay.
Not militarizing space, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for judging, watching, and debating. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, of course.
This was nice. Thanks to all
Good
the
luck
judges.
and good job, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.